If you turn on the news right now, you are being sold a very simple, very comfortable story. An unprovoked invasion, a heroic defense of democracy, and a necessary sacrifice from you, the taxpayer, to keep Europe safe. But what if that story requires erasing 8 years of history? What if the necessary sacrifice you're making at the gas pump in the grocery store isn't funding democracy, but funding the greatest transatlantic wealth transfer of our generation? Today, we are stripping away the slogans, ignoring the PR, and looking at the actual receipts from the engineered regime change in 2014 to the bombing of their own citizens to the deliberate sabotage of peace. It is time to look at who is dying in the trenches, who is freezing in the UK, and which elites are laughing all the way to the bank.
Yeah, and just to put that wealth transfer into perspective right out of the gate, I mean, consider this. Well, the average working family, like you guys listening in the UK or Germany, spent the last few years watching your grocery bills climb by, 20%, and your heating costs basically double.
Right, which has been brutal.
Exactly. But while that's happening, Russian billionaires, the exact people these economic policies were supposedly designed to punish, they actually saw their collective wealth surge to nearly $700 billion.
That is just, wait, 700 billion?
Yeah, nearly $700 billion. The sanctions didn't break them at all. It literally handed them the greatest domestic monopoly of the 21st century.
That staggering contradiction is, well, it's exactly why we're doing this today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are officially setting aside the evening news sound bites, and, we're doing something far more rigorous here.
Absolutely. We're tracking the actual documented timeline of the Ukraine crisis all the way from 2014 to the present day.
Right, and we have a really dense stack of source material today. We've got leaked diplomatic audio published by the BBC. We have these really comprehensive geopolitical logs, financial intelligence from Rinny and Telly News, and some incredibly deep investigative reporting on UK psychological operations from the World Socialist website.
But before we even pull the first thread on this timeline, we do need to establish a very clear framework for you, the listener.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because the sources we are analyzing today are very dense, and they contain highly charged political arguments that, quite frankly, fundamentally challenge the mainstream Western narrative of this entire conflict.
Exactly. So we need to explicitly state right now that neither of us nor this show are endorsing or taking sides on these viewpoints. It really doesn't matter if these arguments lean left-wing, right-wing, or anywhere in between.
Right. Our role is strictly analytical. We are just here to impartially unpack the claims, the mathematical data, and the historical arguments that are presented in this specific stack of source material.
Yeah, we're basically just acting as your guides to the mechanics of these documents so you can evaluate the evidence for yourself. So let's just start at the chronological beginning, which is February 2014. The events in Kyiv, right around the Maidan Square. Now, the conventional story we've all been told is that this was a beautiful, spontaneous democratic uprising. The revolution of dignity, right?
That's the PR version, yes.
Right. The narrative is that the Ukrainian people just organically rose up, and the corrupt, Russian-leaning president, Viktor Yanukovych, he simply fled into the night. And that paved the way for a democratic, pro-European government. But when we look at the actual constitutional math in these sources, that story just, it falls apart entirely.
It really does. The math is totally unforgiving. To understand the actual mechanics of what happened in February 2014, you have to look strictly at the legal framework of the Ukrainian constitution as it existed at that exact moment.
Okay, so what did the Constitution actually say?
Well, specifically, we have to look at Article 111. That's the article that outlines the impeachment process. And it was designed to be incredibly rigorous, precisely to prevent the kind of political instability we ended up seeing.
So for those who aren't familiar with Ukrainian constitutional law, which is probably most of us, how difficult was it to legally remove a sitting president?
Extremely difficult. The Constitution allowed for early termination of a presidency in only 4 specific scenarios: resignation, severe health issues, death, or formal impeachment.
Right. And he didn't resign, he didn't die, and he wasn't sick. So impeachment is the only option left.
Exactly. But impeachment under Article 111 required a massive multi-step process. First, they had to form a special investigatory commission. Then, those findings had to be reviewed and validated by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine.
Okay, so a full judicial review.
Yes. And finally, removing the president required a strict 3/4 supermajority vote in the parliament.
Okay, let's do the math on that. The Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, has 450 seats, right?
Right. 450 seats, which means that to legally remove President Yanukovych, the opposition needed exactly 338 votes, not a single vote less.
338 votes. So what actually happened when they held that vote on February 22nd?
They secured 328 votes.
Wait, 328. So they fell 10 votes short of the actual legal requirement.
They fell 10 votes short. But honestly, the vote count is only part of the constitutional violation here. They also entirely bypassed the investigatory commission and completely skipped the mandatory review by the Constitutional Court.
You're kidding. They just skipped the Supreme Court, basically.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they knew they didn't have the legal numbers or the time to follow the actual process. So the parliament effectively just invented a brand new legal concept out of thin air.
What do you mean they invented a concept?
They passed this hastily written resolution claiming that Yanukovych had, quote, unconstitutionally withdrawn from his duties just because he had left the capital.
Wow, they literally redefined the law on the spot. I mean, imagine if the UK Prime Minister was violently chased out of London by an armed militia.
Right.
And then Parliament holds a vote to remove him, mathematically fails to get the legal percentage of votes required by British law, but decides to just ignore the law, skip the Supreme Court entirely, and install a new government anyway. We wouldn't call that protecting democracy. I mean, the dictionary calls that a coup d'etat.
And the physical reality on the ground is the crucial context here, too. Yanukovych didn't just pack his bags and leave for a vacation to create a convenient political vacuum.
Right. He didn't just wander off.
No, he fled because the security apparatus in Kyiv had completely collapsed under the pressure of armed far-right paramilitaries.
And this is where we really need to explain who was actually on the streets, because the news showed us college students holding signs, but that wasn't the whole picture.
Not at all.
Yeah.
While there were undoubtedly thousands of ordinary Ukrainians protesting for closer ties to Europe, the physical vanguard of the protests, the groups actually seizing government buildings and violently clashing with riot police, those were highly organized ultranationalist coalitions. Groups like Right Sector.
Yeah, let's talk about Right Sector, because they weren't a political party. They were a militant umbrella organization of fringe neo-fascist and nationalist groups, right?
Exactly. They were the ones with the shields, the clubs, and eventually the firearms. And they were the ones dictating terms.
How so?
Well, on February 21st, the political opposition had actually signed a European-brokered peace agreement with Yanukovych. It called for a transitional government and early elections.
So there was a peaceful off-ramp right there.
There was. But the militant factions on the ground, the paramilitaries, they publicly rejected that deal. They took the stage at the Maidan and issued a literal ultimatum.
What was the ultimatum?
They said if Yanukovych didn't resign by morning, they would launch an armed assault on the presidential administration building. And that immediate threat of violence is what forced the democratically elected president to evacuate for his own physical safety.
I mean, you cannot violently threaten a leader, force him to flee to avoid being murdered by a mob, and then use his forced absence as a legal loophole to bypass your own constitution's strict impeachment threshold. That is the literal definition of engineered regime change.
Yeah, it really is.
And the sources show this wasn't just some domestic dispute that accidentally boiled over. There is a massive, highly documented footprint of United States involvement here.
The diplomatic and financial footprint is just staggering. Yeah. To understand the scale, you have to look at public statements made just a few months prior.
Right, in late 2013.
Yeah. In December 2013, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland publicly boasted to an audience that the United States had invested $5 billion to, in her words, support Ukraine's European aspirations and build democratic institutions.
$5 billion. Let's just translate what that means in geopolitical terms. That is a multi-billion-dollar buyout of a sovereign nation's political infrastructure.
Absolutely.
That money goes to NGOs, media outlets, political organizers. It basically creates an entire shadow ecosystem completely aligned with Washington's interests. And Washington didn't just send checks, right? They sent sitting politicians to incite the crowds.
Yeah. Also in December 2013, U.S. Senator John McCain flew to Kyiv. And he didn't just observe the protests from a balcony or something.
No, he was right in it.
He stood on a stage in the Maidan Square alongside Oleg Tynybok, who was the leader of the far-right's Svoboda Party, and McCain was directly addressing and riling up the anti-government crowds.
Try to visualize the inverse of that for a second. Imagine if a high-ranking Chinese or Russian official flew to Washington, D.C., stood on a stage with an armed extremist anti-government militia, and cheered on the overthrow of the U.S. government.
It would instantly be classified as an act of war.
Exactly. But when Washington does it in Eastern Europe, the media frames it as democracy promotion. But it gets even crazier. The most explicit piece of evidence regarding how engineered this was isn't a public speech. It's a leaked phone call.
Right, the infamous bugged conversation from early February 2014, weeks before Yanukovych was actually ousted. This audio transcript was published by the BBC, and it features Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt.
And honestly, this transcript reads like two corporate executives deciding who gets to be the regional manager after a hostile takeover.
That's exactly what it sounds like. They are literally handpicking the new leadership of a sovereign European nation while the democratically elected president is still sitting in his office.
What exactly do they say in the call?
Well, Nuland is actively managing the opposition figures. She evaluates them by name, and she dictates that Arseniy Yatsenyuk should be the one to lead the new government. She says, and I quote, "I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience."
Wow.
And simultaneously, she sidelines other prominent opposition leaders like Vitaly Klitschko. She states explicitly, "I don't think it's a good idea for him to go into the government."
Yats is the guy. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know the historical punchline here, just weeks after this phone call, Yanukovych is chased out of the country, the constitution is ignored, and guess who magically becomes the new prime minister?
Arseniy Yatsenyuk.
Yep, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. It's unbelievable.
And the depth of U.S. orchestration revealed in that transcript goes even further. Nuland talks about bringing in the United Nations to, quote, help glue this thing, and mentions that U.S. Vice President Joe Biden is ready to step in for an attaboy to lock the transition in place.
They were architecting the post-Coup government down to the staffing details.
Yeah.
And then she delivers the line that completely exposed the reality of Western diplomacy at the time.
Yeah, she was frustrated that the European Union was taking a slower, more cautious diplomatic approach to the crisis, rather than aggressively pushing for the immediate transition she wanted.
So what does she say?
She bluntly tells Ambassador Pyatt, "Fuck the EU."
Just breathtaking arrogance. So let's summarize the genesis here for the listener. You have a democratically elected president. The U.S. pours $5 billion into shaping the political environment. U.S. senators fly in to incite the crowds. U.S. diplomats are caught on tape explicitly choosing the new prime minister. Armed, right-wing paramilitaries physically threaten the president until he flees. The parliament falls 10 votes short of a legal impeachment, ignores the Constitutional Court, and installs the exact guy the U.S. diplomats picked on that phone call.
Exactly.
And we are told this was an organic democratic revolution.
And the real tragedy here is that this unconstitutional transition did not bring peace. It ignited what the sources refer to as the silent war.
Silent war.
Because the political fallout in Ukraine was immediate and violently polarizing.
Well, yeah, because Ukraine is a massive country with deep demographic divides. If you lived in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbas region, or down in the south, you had overwhelmingly voted for Yanukovych. He was your political voice.
Really, he was their guy.
And you just watched him get illegally overthrown by a Western-backed mob in the capital. So what was the immediate response from the new government in Kiev toward these people in the east?
Instead of attempting to heal the divide, the new unconstitutional regime made a series of highly provocative legislative moves. One of their very first actions was an attempt to repeal a law that gave the Russian language official regional status.
Oh, wow. So they went straight after their culture.
Yes. It was a direct threat to the cultural and political identity of the millions of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians living in the East.
So, feeling disenfranchised and threatened, the people in the East protested. And what's really fascinating in the sources is that they copied the exact same playbook that the Maidan protesters had just used in Kiev.
That is such a critical parallel. In April 2014, anti-Maidan protesters and local militias in the Donbas region seized regional government administration buildings in cities like Donetsk and Luhansk.
Right.
They were utilizing the exact same tactic-occupying state infrastructure that the Western-backed protesters had used to achieve regime change in Kiev just a few months earlier.
But the response from the state was entirely different, wasn't it? When Western-backed protesters seized buildings in Kyiv, it was heralded as a revolution of dignity.
Exactly.
But when Eastern-leaning citizens seized buildings in Donetsk to protest an illegal coup, did the new, unelected regime in Kyiv sit down to negotiate early elections? Did they look for a European-brokered peace deal?
No. They responded with overwhelming military force. On April 14, 2014, the newly installed acting government launched what they officially termed an anti-terrorist operation, or the ATO.
They called their own citizens terrorists?
Yes. They designated half their country as terrorists and mobilized the armed forces to crush the domestic political opposition in the East.
Let's just explain that to the listener like they're five, because it's hard to fathom. A government that wasn't legally elected sent its own military to drop artillery shells on its own cities.
Yes. And the composition of those military forces is vital to understanding the brutality of the conflict, because initially, the regular Ukrainian military was highly reluctant to fire on their own citizens.
Well, sure, they didn't want a civil war.
Right, they didn't want to engage in a civil war. So, to solve this problem, the new regime in Kyiv formally integrated the extremist far-right paramilitaries from the Maidan protest groups like the Azov Battalion and right sector elements directly into the official National Guard.
So they took heavily armed, ideologically extreme nationalist militias, gave them official badges, and sent them to the east to suppress the uprising.
Exactly. And this wasn't some brief skirmish. This was an 8-year grinding civil war that the Western media largely completely ignored.
Let's look at the actual death toll documented in our sources, because it's horrifying.
The data from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR, is just devastating. Between 2014 and 2021, the conflict in the Donbas resulted in over 14,000 total deaths.
14,000?
And most damningly, that number includes over 3,400 verified civilian deaths.
3,400 civilians, men, women, and children, killed because a new unconstitutional government made the active choice to drop artillery on urban centers rather than negotiate with people who rejected a coup.
And this 8-year domestic bombardment is the phantom context that is entirely missing from the modern narrative. It created deep, bleeding grievances in the East, obviously, but it also exhausted the broader Ukrainian public.
I can imagine.
By 2019, the whole country was just tired of the corruption, the economic drain, and the endless nationalist militarization overseen by that post-2014 political establishment.
But before we get to that massive political shift in 2019, I have to ask a structural question here, because it's baffling. If a Western-backed government was shelling its own civilians for 8 years, racking up thousands of UN-verified civilian deaths, how did the Western public not know?
It's a great question.
How did we all just accept the narrative that Ukraine was this peaceful, flawless democracy until February 2022?
Well, that brings us to one of the most revealing documents in our Sama, the World Socialist website investigation into the UK's Integrity Initiative.
Okay, what is that?
It completely exposes the sheer scale of the information warfare being waged. But crucially, this warfare wasn't aimed at foreign enemies. It was aimed directly at the domestic populations in the West.
It's a profound paradox, because if a geopolitical cause is truly righteous, why does a democratic government need to spend millions running secret psychological operations on its own citizens to convince them of it?
Right. To grasp the mechanics of this operation, we have to look at the Institute for Statecraft. On paper, it was a Scottish charity, supposedly dedicated to promoting good governance.
Sounds harmless enough.
Right. But in reality, leaked documents, which are often referred to in intelligence circles as the HMG Trojan Horse files, with HMG standing for Her Majesty's Government, these files revealed this institute was actually the front for a covert propaganda network called the Integrity Initiative.
Wait, and who funded it?
It was heavily funded by the UK Foreign Office. By 2018, they had utilized over £2 million of British taxpayer money to fund this operation.
So British taxpayers were unwittingly funding their own psychological conditioning. That is insane. How did the Integrity Initiative actually function mechanically? Like, what did they do?
The core methodology relied on the creation of what they called clusters. These were covert, highly coordinated networks of assets embedded across different sectors of society, within the government, the military, academia, and crucially, the mainstream media across Europe and the UK.
Wait, let me just pause you there. They had actual working journalists in these intelligence clusters.
The leaked documents list names. They named a cluster of top-tier journalists and TV reporters in the UK, including prominent figures of the Times, The Guardian, the BBC, the Financial Times, and Sky News.
Wow. And what were these journalists doing?
The explicit documented purpose of these clusters was to plant state-approved anti-Russian geopolitical narratives across the media landscape, creating the illusion of an organic, independent journalistic consensus.
It's like a synchronized swimming team hiding underwater. The public just sees 5 different prestigious newspapers simultaneously publishing the exact same headline, using the exact same syntax, and thinks, wow, all these independent journalists arrived at the exact same conclusion. It must be true.
Right.
But beneath the surface, there's a UK intelligence asset coordinating the whole routine.
The documents even explicitly list their operational objectives. One key tactic was, quote, increasing the speed of response, mobilizing the network to activism in pursuit of the golden minute.
The golden minute.
Yeah. In practice, this meant activating their journalist assets to artificially amplify state-sanctioned news stories or drown out opposing viewpoints before the public could process the information.
That is terrifying.
But the operation didn't stop at shaping foreign policy narratives. They actually weaponized this taxpayer-funded network to run domestic smear campaigns against Western politicians who opposed their hawkish, militarized stance.
Yeah, the sources detail the specific targeting of Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the UK Labour Party. And they didn't target him because of his domestic tax policies. They targeted him because his anti-war, non-interventionist stance threatened the permanent militarized posture the Integrity Initiative was trying to build.
And they also targeted independent media outlets, accusing them of the exact dirty tricks, disinformation, and state coordination that the Integrity Initiative itself was actively engaged in.
Talk about projection.
I know. They even mapped out plans to investigate academic targets, like universities with anti-fracking agendas, actively trying to manufacture links to Russian funding just to discredit their domestic environmental activism.
It's just staggering. The UK government was running a military-grade psychological operation on its own soil to edit the villains and the heroes in real time.
Yeah.
And this is exactly how they completely erased the reality of the 2014 unconstitutional coup and the 3,400 dead civilians in the Donbas from the public consciousness. They manufactured a pristine narrative.
And that absolute control of the narrative in the West is what allowed the militarization of Ukraine to continue uninterrupted, which leads us directly into the pivotal, tragic moments of 2019.
Right, let's go to 2019. The Ukrainian public is exhausted by the war in the Donbas. So exhausted, in fact, that a complete political outsider, a comedian who literally played the president on a television show, runs for the actual presidency.
Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yes, and he wins with a massive 73% landslide. And he didn't win by promising to conquer Russia, right? He won explicitly as a peace candidate.
That 73% mandate is crucial to remember. He promised to implement the Minsk agreements.
Can you remind us what those were?
For context, the Minsk agreements weren't just a vague promise of a ceasefire. They were a heavily negotiated, UN-recognized diplomatic roadmap that specifically required Kyiv to grant political autonomy to the Donbas regions.
Okay, so that is the legal framework Zelensky was promising to enforce to stop the bloodshed. So he gets into office, backed by nearly 3/4 of the country, and he tries to execute that peace mandate. What happens when he actually goes to the front lines?
In October 2019, Zelensky travels to the frontline town of Zoloda. His objective is to personally order the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces and the disarmament of the nationalist militias. This was supposed to be the first required step of a mutually agreed troop pullback to kickstart the Minsk peace process.
This is one of the most revealing moments in modern political history, and there is actual video of it. I've read the transcripts in our sources. You have the commander-in-chief, the democratically elected president with an overwhelming mandate, standing face-to-face with these armed paramilitaries in a dimly lit room.
Specifically, he is confronted by armed, right-wing veterans and members of the Azov battalion, and they flatly refuse to disarm.
They just say no.
They refuse his direct legal orders as their commander-in-chief to pull back.
And Zelensky gets visibly frustrated. You can see the realization dawning on him in the video. He says to one of the militiamen, "I'm the president of this country. I'm 41 years old. I'm not a loser. I came to you and told you, remove the weapons."
And their response is chilling because it reveals the true power dynamic in the country. They openly disrespect him.
And what happened after that confrontation?
Following that meeting, the leader of the National Corps, which is a far-right political wing tied to the Azov movement, publicly threatened Zelensky on video. He stated that if the president tried to forcefully remove those veterans from Zoloda, he would send 10,000 more heavily armed fighters to the front line to replace them and actively defy the government.
Wow.
They threatened massive unrest, essentially a second violent mutiny in Kyiv, if Zelensky dared to sign a peace deal.
Stop and think about the gravity of that for a second. If he had a 73% mandate, which is virtually unheard of in modern European democracies, how do a few thousand guys with rifles overrule the democratic will of tens of millions of people? Logistically, how does a government capitulate to that?
Because 73% of the public vote doesn't matter if the heavily armed, Western-backed paramilitary factions are willing to use violence against the state, and the state's security apparatus is too fractured to stop them.
Right.
Zelensky faced a brutal choice. stand up to the hardliners, and risk being violently ousted, just like Yanukovych was in 2014, or capitulate to them.
And he chose self-preservation. He bottled it.
He completely capitulated. He realized he could not govern against the will of the paramilitaries and the Western intelligence apparatus that had spent 5 years arming and funding them. So he absorbed them.
How do you mean?
The independent militias were fully integrated into the state military structure, the peace platforms were entirely abandoned, and Zelensky adopted the exact same maximalist, militarized posture of the post-2014 establishment that he had explicitly campaigned against. The peace candidate was captured by the proxy war machine.
Which brings us to the eve of the massive 2022 escalation. The dominant narrative we are told every single day is that the invasion was completely unprovoked. We are told that diplomacy was utterly impossible, that there was no alternative to war.
This story, yeah.
But the geopolitical logs in our sources dismantle that myth completely. Let's look at the diplomatic reality just weeks before the conflict exploded.
A prime example of the West's fundamentally unserious theatrical approach to diplomacy occurred in February 2022. UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss visited Moscow for a highly anticipated closed-door meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Oh, this is the meeting that Lavrov later described to the press as a conversation between the mute and the deaf. What actually happened in that room?
Well, according to the diplomatic reports, Lavrov set a rhetorical trap to test Truss's basic understanding of the conflict. He asked her point blank if she recognized Russian sovereignty over Rostov and Voronezh.
Okay, for anyone who doesn't have a map of Eastern Europe handy, Rostov and Voronezh are not in Ukraine. They are not disputed territories. They are universally recognized, undisputed Russian cities located well inside the internationally recognized borders of Russia.
Exactly. But Truss, seemingly completely ignorant of the basic regional geography of the crisis she was there to negotiate, mistakenly believed these were Ukrainian regions that Russia was trying to claim.
You have got to be kidding me.
No, she adamantly stated to Lavrov that the UK would never recognize Russian sovereignty over them. The British ambassador to Russia, who was sitting right next to her, literally had to interject during the meeting to correct his own foreign secretary, explaining that Rostov and Voronezh are, in fact, part of Russia.
Wait, she thought undisputed Russian cities were in Ukraine? That's like the U.S. Secretary of State flying to London to negotiate a treaty and threatening to never recognize British sovereignty over Manchester.
It's embarrassing.
To say that's embarrassing is an understatement. It is a diplomatic car crash. It proved that Western diplomats weren't there to do the grueling, nuanced work of peacemaking. They didn't even know the geography. They were just there to recite pre-written PR scripts for a domestic audience back home.
And that hostility to diplomacy didn't stop when the fighting actually started. In fact, it escalated into outright, deliberate sabotage.
This is perhaps the most critical piece of the timeline in dismantling the no alternative to war myth.
Fast forward to March and early April 2022, just weeks into the full-scale conflict.
The Istanbul talks.
Yes. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators were meeting in Belarus and then Istanbul, Turkey. And according to multiple reports, leaked drafts, and later admissions from participants on both sides, they had made significant progress toward a tentative peace framework.
Wait, so a workable deal to end the war was actually on the table?
It was.
What were the actual mechanics of this draft deal? How did it work?
The draft essentially involved Ukraine committing to permanent neutrality, meaning officially abandoning its constitutional aspirations to join NATO in exchange for ironclad international security guarantees from a coalition of states.
Okay, so they stay neutral but get protected. And what about Russia?
In return for this neutrality, Russia would withdraw its military forces to the pre-February 2022 lines. It was a pragmatic compromise that would have stopped the slaughter in its infancy, prevented the destruction of the country's infrastructure, and kept Ukraine's borders largely intact.
So peace was literally within reach. The war could have ended in April 2022. Millions of refugees wouldn't have had to flee. Hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved. What happened?
On April 9th, 2022, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a sudden surprise visit to Kyiv.
Okay.
According to extensive reporting from Ukrainian media outlets like Ukrainska Pravda, Johnson delivered two very clear messages to Zelensky. First, he stated that Putin was a war criminal who should be pressured, not negotiated with.
And the second message?
Second, and most importantly, Johnson told Kyiv that even if Ukraine was ready to sign an agreement with Russia, the collective West was not.
Let me just repeat that so the sheer weight of it lands. The collective West was not ready for peace.
Shortly after Johnson's visit, the diplomatic track completely collapsed. Zelensky walked away from the negotiating table. The UK and the US promised massive, endless influxes of weapons and financial aid,
Right?
and the conflict shifted from a localized war that could have been resolved through neutrality into a protracted, grinding proxy war of attrition.
It's horrifying. Boris Johnson flew in, representing the Western consensus, and explicitly told them to scrap diplomacy and just fight. And as a direct result of that intervention, hundreds of thousands of working-class men have been fed into a trench warfare meat grinder.
When you view these events in sequence, I mean, from the U.S.-engineered transition in 2014 to the 8 years of shelling the Donbas, to the paramilitary sabotage of the 2019 peace mandate, to Boris Johnson actively scuttling the Istanbul peace deal in 2022, the narrative of an unprovoked conflict with no alternative to war completely shatters.
It wasn't an accident. It was a conscious engineered policy. But settling peace to deliberately prolong a proxy war of this magnitude requires an immense amount of money and resources.
Right, mountains of money.
The weapons, the logistics, the economic blockades, it's astronomical. Which brings us to the core of this deep dive. The economics. Who is actually paying for this and who is profiting from the meat grinder?
This is where we must turn to the financial intelligence data from Warney's IntelliNews, because it exposes the grand illusion of the economic war.
The sanctions, you mean?
Yes. The Western public was sold a very specific narrative, that sweeping sanctions would cripple the Russian elite, fracture the regime from the inside, and end the war.
Right. We were told we had to endure higher prices at home, inflation, and energy rationing, because it was a necessary sacrifice to economically destroy the Russian oligarchs and defund the war machine. But the math shows the exact opposite happened, didn't it?
Totally the opposite. The unintended or perhaps entirely foreseeable consequences of these sanctions have resulted in the greatest transatlantic wealth transfer of our generation.
Give me the numbers.
According to Forbes and Deuce and IntelliNews data from 2026, the combined wealth of Russia's billionaires has surged to a staggering $696.5 billion.
Almost $700 billion.
To put that astronomical figure in perspective, that $696.5 billion surpasses the total savings of the entire Russian population held in term bank deposits, which sits at around $587 billion.
Oh my God.
The oligarchs' wealth has almost doubled since the war began in 2022, and the number of Russian billionaires has hit a record high of 155 individuals.
Wait, how is that mathematically possible? We were shown videos of Western governments seizing their super yachts. We froze their bank accounts. How did they double their wealth under the most severe, comprehensive sanctions regime in human history?
Because the sanctions, while deeply disruptive to global supply chains, were largely theatrical when it came to elite wealth.
Theatrical?
Yeah. While they made great PR headlines, seizing a luxury villa in Italy here, a yacht in Monaco there, the reality is that only a fraction of their total wealth was actually accessible to Western authorities. Quinny IntelliNews estimates that only about $22 billion of oligarch money was genuinely frozen since 2022.
$22 billion sounds like a massive number to an ordinary person, but out of $700 billion.
It's roughly 3% of their total wealth.
3%. We completely upended the global economy, triggered a cost of living crisis across Europe, and fundamentally altered global trade routes to freeze 3% of their money.
But the real story is the mechanical why behind their surging wealth. By freezing that 3% and threatening their offshore assets, the West forced the oligarchs into a corner.
What did they do?
They had to repatriate their money. They had to pull their vast fortunes out of Western tax havens, out of London real estate, and bring it back into the Russian economy to protect it.
Okay, so the money goes back to Russia.
Yes, and at the exact same time, Western multinational corporations, under immense political pressure, were pulling out of the Russian market en masse.
Oh, I see the mechanism. It's the biggest fire sale in history.
Exactly. You had Russian oligarchs, suddenly flush with repatriated cash, sitting in an economy where hundreds of Western companies were abandoning their assets, factories, and market share. Wow. The oligarchs were able to buy up these abandoned assets at rock bottom, federally mandated discount prices. The sanctions effectively handed the oligarchs a total captive domestic monopoly.
So they just bought everything up.
Right. Cut off from the global economy, they doubled down on their investments inside Russia, extracting massive profits from a captive consumer base. This made them astronomically wealthier and, ironically, far more dependent on and integrated with Putin's state apparatus than they ever were before. The sanctions didn't fracture the elite, they consolidated them.
So, what does this all mean for the listener? It's like cheering for an arsonist to burn down your neighbor's house, demanding a moral medal because you crowdfunded a blanket for them to shiver under in the ashes, and then the arsonist sells you that blanket at a 44% markup.
That's a painfully accurate analogy.
Because while the Russian elites are swimming in record billions, let's look at the brutal reality for the working class who are actually paying for this policy.
We have to bring this geopolitical maneuvering directly home to the listener's wallet. The deliberate disruption of cheap, reliable Russian energy, combined with the central banks printing billions of dollars and pounds to fund foreign proxy wars, acted as a massive regressive tax on the European and British middle class.
The sources outline the devastating domestic cost of this wealth transfer. Let's look at the UK.
In the UK, inflation hit a 41-year high of 11.1% in 2022. Food inflation, which is the cost of basic survival, peaked at an agonizing 19.1%.
And energy.
The average UK energy bill is currently sitting 44% higher than it was before this escalation began.
So let's summarize the board here. The working classes of Europe and the UK are enduring crushing inflation, the rationing of energy, and skyrocketing mortgage rates that are destroying the dream of homeownership.
Right.
The Russian working class is being drafted and fed into a trench warfare meat grinder. The Ukrainian working class is having their entire country, their infrastructure, and their demographic future completely decimated. But the elites.
The Russian oligarchs hit record wealth through domestic monopolies. Transnational energy cartels post record-shattering profits by selling liquefied natural gas at massive markups to replace the Sanction pipeline gas.
And the defense contractors.
Oh, Western defense contractors are seeing their stock prices soar to historic highs as governments empty their arsenals and sign multi-billion-dollar replenishment contracts spanning the next decade.
It's an absolute racket. The political class demands that the British and European taxpayer bankrupt themselves to stand with Ukraine, while the actual policies they enact mathematically impoverish their own constituents, hollow out the middle class, and directly enrich the very billionaires they claim to be fighting.
Which brings us to the profound hypocrisy of the so-called rules-based order that these politicians constantly invoke to justify these actions.
Let's talk about that.
The sources argue compellingly that we don't actually have a rules-based order. We have a words-based order. The political establishment and the media control the syntax to launder the actions of their allies while using the exact same actions to condemn their enemies.
Let's look at the starkest example of the syntax manipulation from the demographic comparisons in our logs. The media constantly frames the conflict in Ukraine as a war of unchecked, apocalyptic civilian slaughter, implying an intentional genocide of the population.
Yet the demographic data tells a very specific clinical story. If you look at the verified UN data for Ukraine, out of the total civilian casualties, children make up roughly 5.4%.
Okay.
Now, it goes without saying that every single death is a profound tragedy, but demographically, that 5.4% reflects the tragic reality of a conventional industrial military conflict. It is a war designed to chew up adults, working-class men fighting in frontline trenches. Adults, primarily men, are the primary collateral damage.
Now contrast that 5.4% with the demographic data coming out of Gaza.
In Gaza, demographic breakdowns of the civilian casualties show that children make up roughly 43% to 45% of the civilians killed.
Wait, 45%?
Yes, nearly 1 out of every 2 body bags is a minor.
You cannot look at a civilian casualty pool where nearly 50% are children and logically call it targeted, proportionate self-defense. It is a demographic slaughter.
And yet, look at the vocabulary used by the Western political class. When Russia crosses a border, it is an unprovoked invasion and an existential threat to democracy that requires the UK to bankrupt itself to stop it. The 5.4% child casualty rate is cited as proof of unparalleled evil.
Right. But when an allied nation occupies land, flouts international law, and facilitates a staggering 45% child casualty rate, it is sanitized in the press as a security buffer or a complex real estate dispute.
Exactly. The UK and US don't issue sanctions. They provide diplomatic cover, veto UN resolutions, and supply the military logistics to continue it.
They completely control the words. Russia bombs a power plant. That's terror. An ally starves a population of 2 million people. That's self-defense. The media doesn't report the objective news. They just edit the villains depending on which flag is painted on the side of the tank.
And if we connect this systemic manipulation to the bigger picture, to the broader 2030 agenda concept mentioned heavily in the sources, we begin to see this permanent state of global crisis, not as a series of unfortunate accidents, but as a deliberate mechanism for managed decline.
Let's dive deep into that. Explain managed decline. How does an endless war in Eastern Europe or the Middle East translate into controlling the domestic population?
Well, the theory of managed decline posits that endless foreign emergencies, whether it's a proxy war in Eastern Europe, a regional conflagration in the Middle East, or a global health crisis, are utilized or actively manufactured to condition the domestic public.
Condition them how?
When the state is perpetually in a state of supreme emergency, the psychological resistance of the public is worn down. It becomes much easier to convince the population to accept a lower standard of living.
Because you're constantly told that complaining about your grocery bill is unpatriotic when there's a war on.
Exactly. You are conditioned to accept the normalization of inflation, the erosion of purchasing power, and the reality of poverty. The necessary sacrifices you are forced to make, paying more for gas, accepting carbon taxes, moving towards centralized digital currencies for state distribution of relief, they all serve to hollow out the independent middle class.
And a middle class without money is compliant. A middle class with savings is politically independent. A public that relies on state subsidies just to heat their homes is compliant. These endless wars are the engine that drives the transfer of wealth upward, consolidating corporate and state power while managing the controlled decline of Western living standards.
Wow, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. From the constitutional math of the 2014 regime change, to Victoria Nuland's leaked phone calls organizing a hostile takeover, to the UK's Integrity Initiative running psychological operations on its own journalists, to Boris Johnson explicitly scuttling peace, all the way down to the mechanism of the 44% markup on your energy bills.
That's a lot to take in. It really is. As we wrap up this analysis of the timeline, what is the final, most important takeaway? What is the one philosophical thread the listener needs to hold on to?
Consider how the exact same tactics of information control, unverified claims, and emotional manipulation discussed today are currently being deployed to justify the next massive military escalation in the Middle East. If the political class is willing to erase 8 years of constitutional math and civilian shelling in Eastern Europe to sell you a war, ask yourself, what history are they deliberately erasing right now to sell you the next one?
You cannot maximize war and minimize suffering at the same time. The politicians cheering for maximum escalation aren't paying for it, you are. The people demanding we reject diplomacy aren't fighting in the trenches. They are buying defense stocks. Stop letting them use your morality to empty your wallet. Question the timeline, follow the money, and realize that true anti-war resistance starts with recognizing when your own political class is treating you as acceptable collateral. Thanks for listening. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear the timeline, and I'll see you next time.